Hi, everyone. I'm Jagger Waters, and I research the weekly AI film news web show for Curious Refuge, released every Friday. And I'm here with Fred Grinstein, the host of the Curious Refuge podcast, where he interviews leaders and creators, and also a teacher in the AI documentary course. And Caleb Ward, the co-founder of Curious Refuge. So we're here today to talk about the AI film news of the week, all the tool updates, and the biggest headlines we saw for AI filmmaking.
Super exciting. I am really excited to start doing these deep dives on the news because there's only so much time to talk about these things in the web show. And so just having an outlet to really have a conversation with folks about the news and what it means is it's really important and fun. And this is going to be great.
Yeah, it'll be fun to bring perspective after, we spend so much time with these tools each week, preparing for the web show. And it's like, where's an opportunity to kind of speak, more broadly and also more specifically about each little update and kind of its place in this AI ecosystem.
I also find that anytime I meet somebody who thinks they know everything, I'm usually like suspicious of them. And I think so much of this has been about showing up to events and being in conversation with people that are equally exploring. I think whatever this all turns into is going to be a product of us all comparing notes and talking about all this stuff and figuring it out together. So I appreciate both of your brains to help me figure out this stuff.
Yeah, it's no problem at all. I think that it is overwhelming to try to keep up to date with all of this stuff and to contextualize it. So having some friends that you can chat with to help guide you is super important.
So look, busy week as always. It is never a dull moment in this space. But what stuck out to you? Like if there's one thing that stuck out to you, Jagger, that is kind of getting you to either think twice or get excited, what's a piece of news that stuck out to you?
Okay, this is a weird place to start, but it's something that I can't unsee now that I've seen it, which is the design of these tools and the platform and the interface itself. They are starting to all look so similar that sometimes I'm like, what tool am I even looking at? Like, is this ideogram or Kriya or Hyper or Kyber? Like, they have the same kind of look, like the rounded edges font and like a lot of purple and white. And I'm just seeing this sort of like design aesthetic similarity where they're all copying each other. And it kind of distracts me from it's like, how is this tool different from the other one?
I've seen the same thing. I feel like maybe Runway was one of the early ones to have that type of serif type face, and they're just they're using aesthetics that are popular with streetwear brands and things like that, and bringing that into online user interfaces as well. But I 100% see like a homogenization of a lot of the designs, and I don't know if that's for the user a bad thing. Like for the company, differentiating yourself I think is important, but I think what they're all realizing is they're so scared to be too different that they just try to copy each other, whether it's in the design or even in the functionality or even when they announce certain things. Like I feel like what we're seeing with AI tools, it feels a lot like Hollywood, where there will be an announcement for some, I don't know, ancient Rome movie from one studio, and then a month later there's an announcement from another studio and they're working on a similar project, and it feels like nobody wants to go off the rails and be too different because they're afraid of getting left behind. And so there's just a lot of similarities that tend to pop up.
I mean, it sort of reminds me a little bit of the recent streamer wars.
Yeah, it happened
Look, at some point we're on the other side of it in terms of TV, that there really wasn't room for all these streamers, or at least that they weren't necessarily all going to suddenly 10x the amount of eyeballs there are on planet Earth to watch TV. And I not that I wish anything, but good luck to all these different companies. But it seems inevitable that at some point there will be a cleaner, more elegant user experience for making stuff. And I don't know, it's funny. I was talking to my co-founder Min earlier today. We were talking about a few things, but there does seem to be this trend as we talk about tools. We're ultimately talking about users, And like there does feel to be these three camps emerging, as far as the way they're being marketed to, and as far as their way they're being built towards, is that there's sort of this like crowd of people that will probably love an Adobe Creative Suite that just kind of has everything in one place,
Mhm, mhm.
or what LTX is doing, or what a few kind of products are sort of driving towards a kind of like, I don't know if it's a walled garden, but it's like a keep it simple for me. I don't have to
Mhm.
jump around too much. And I feel like there's this like second crowd that's a bit more adventurous and maybe has even been here a bit longer. That's
Right.
like having fun with like this sort of, rinse and repeat of Midjourney to Runway or insert Luma or Kling, and then some kind of repeatable. But most of these are very like closed source, um, quick subscription tools that have some kind of reasonable user friendliness. And then there's this like comfy UI crowd, that just kind of live on spaceships. And every now and then they descend at one of our events, and you're just like, whoa, I don't even know how all those things came
You're
together.
doing what? Yeah.
And
Yeah,
it's
that's like
go
it
ahead.
goes it just makes me think about, yeah, wait, as there's this push towards who's gonna make the ultimate all-in-one platform, and that, it seems like Adobe's doing that, maybe Runway will get there too. But I think that, like what you were saying, comparing those, I think that some of the most interesting work comes from people who do experiment and combine tools. So I don't know if the total dependence on one ultimate platform to rule them all will ever yield the best creative. I think that's simpler for those who want like a simple streamlined process, but like you were pointing out with Comfy UI and this sort of like more complex um workflow, that yields a lot more, I think, better, more interesting innovation.
But
So
it to me, it ultimately feels like there's different types of consumers, and at some point, which ones make these products money and let them thrive. But
yeah.
like, just talk about editing for a second. There's these like Opus type tools that you're like, I don't even want to I don't want to do anything. I'm literally just going to take this interview that we're doing right now and just let some robot figure it out. They'll subtitle it. Some percentage of the outputs are, not useful. Some of them are awesome, but that serves me, right? And then I actually want to be really creative and I want to work with Premiere Pro and access a lot of different choices creatively. So I just think like ultimately we're seeing this sort of much more dimensional creator crowd that has different purposes. Like maybe they're just selling a new type of toothpaste, and like that doesn't need to be a Christopher Nolan movie. But then there's people that want to be Christopher Nolan and they suddenly have access to all these amazing ranges of choices.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that what we're going to see, because right now a lot of AI tools basically they come out with their own platform, right? We have our Runway, our Luma, our Minimax, or insert whatever tool there. And what it feels like is happening is people are getting fatigued by having a subscription to 20 different things. And it's not intuitive to go to each one of these tools individually to get your creative output. Now, of course, for certain specific use cases, you might need to go to a tool. But I think that whenever video editing applications have very clear plugins and APIs that allow you to get the most out of those tools directly inside of, let's say, Premiere Pro, and you can have your Runway module generating your video, which like they demoed like 6 months ago, and that hasn't come into fruition, so I have no idea when that's actually going to be here. But I think it's in those like secondary plugins that I think there's going to be a much more streamlined and a more flow state creative process that you can get into whenever you are doing video editing. And to your point on like creators, Fred, I think Canva is really outlining what future acquisitions might look like for that world, because they acquired Leonardo a few months ago. And Canva is an incredible tool. I used to like throw shade at Canva like 6, 7 years ago, and now I can't imagine doing creative day to day work without it. And they're baking in the image generators, the video generators, all of those like high end AI tools directly into the workflow. And it's very easy to use. And so I think for the average creator who is not a deep full time filmmaker who's using CapCut or using Canva for creative processes, that's really good news. And I think tools like Adobe or DaVinci Resolve, they're going to have to open that up, or they're definitely going to get left behind.
It's super interesting, and it's kind of like a broader pattern of the middle, the middle consumers, and there are a lot more people, there's a lot more entrepreneurs and people that are suddenly able to express their products or their visions or their impact goals or their missions with video and these tools that, none of them are worried about red carpets or, whether or not Hollywood's in trouble. Like they're just like, no, I suddenly have an ability to express myself. And yeah, to think that Leonardo enters the conversation seemingly alongside all these other tools. Runway, for example, to me has always had a very filmmaker forward culture. It appeals to me. I like the way they speak to people that sample their product. And it's interesting that somewhere at Leonardo that are like, actually, and I'm not saying instead of, I don't know anything about their business goals, but yeah, this canvas setting is amazing. Like, I don't know if that was on everybody's mind that was making, image generated. So I think
Yeah.
these are really interesting moments to learn about why products succeed and where the consumers are.
Yeah, and the accessibility you were talking about is kind of doing this thing that I'm noticing as a writer where even more so than the past, it's like because it's expression and promotion, right? It can elevate both of those things. So it's turning into this like Ouroboros, like snake eating its tail of like marketing is storytelling, storytelling is marketing. And that's what I see now in so much that of what people are creating, whether it is about a product or their own narrative that they're just kind of cultivating an audience for. Those lines are really blurring in a cool way.
Yeah, and I think to echo that point, we were just had our AI filmmaking meetup in LA last night, and we were chatting with some folks about just like how to get your projects off the ground. And because a lot of people they come to us and they're like, I've tried for years in Hollywood and nothing's working. Like it's just whether they just aren't getting in the right doors, people aren't resonating with the ideas, and they're always like, how do I turn this into something? And like my best advice to them is always create stuff and put it online and create demand for that story, and that is your best tool for getting your idea off the ground, because there are so many people who are decision makers that can give you the financing or the connections you need to get a larger story off the ground, and all you need to do is just prove and kind of do some of that marketing on the front end to do a proof of concept essentially. And that's not just an indie trend, like that's a trend that's happening at the macro studio level with testing out film ideas with trailers before they even exist. Like that's the norm now. Like that's not something that's a futuristic thing. That's like what you do if you want to get a big project off the ground.
For the individual, we saw it happen to musicians and comedians first. Like this was always coming for filmmakers and writers, but especially like 15 years ago, that with musicians being like, well, you have to just put stuff out on SoundCloud. You just have to start releasing work. And with the sort of Instagram and TikToks for comedians, where it's like you are creating a portfolio of work that demonstrates what you can do. But that is labor that you kind of have to do unpaid for a while. And that's what I think that filmmakers are realizing too, where it's like, yeah, this could, showcase what I'm capable of, but it is a lot of like self-producing for a long time. And hopefully it catches attention and then leads to a deal. But it just, I saw it happened in waves to other groups of artists. And now it's coming for directors and writers, I think.
Because the technologies arrived to make it possible. I mean, I always think about kind of like when I got out of college and was starting to work, and I lived with a painter as my roommate. And I remember just trying to communicate the differences between what we did every day with him. And I would just watch him like start painting something and then just change his mind and throw it away. And, sometimes he picked up his guitar and made some music. And I'm like, I don't get to do that. I don't get to get reasonably far along my ideation process to sort of realize that something sucks. And then get to say I'm going to use my time on something that might not suck. And I think that basic component was because I needed to go get a bunch of people to show up to a set. I needed to sometimes raise money or borrow somebody else's money, and it would take a whole day, maybe a whole week to even make that sizzle. Forget maybe even just make that short film that I, after hitting complete on the edit, I'm like, wow, that really wasn't very good, but I guess I just spent the last 6 weeks of my life making that. That whole thing is suddenly possible in a much shorter amount of time. And I think to your point, Jagger, like it's allowing this medium to enter that flow of other creators who've all started to build personal brands, personal businesses off of their ideation process, their sharing process. And I think it also does a really important thing is, especially with these platforms, it creates communities, it creates followings, it creates people that, you know, want to support you because that's part of the fan experience too. Like the same reason I sample somebody's art by paying for a ticket to see them perform live. Well, now I'm sometimes supporting your Substack, or sometimes I'm vibing with what you did, and I really want to help promote you. So I don't know. There's just something really interesting happening to a medium and an industry that used to feel walled off from this sort of speed and ability for an individual or a smaller group of people to get a shot. You know.
Yeah, and it lets them fail like faster and earlier, which I think is good. You know, I heard someone say that on a panel once, and I was like, oh yeah, that instead of the resources, the time spent, Fred, to what you were saying, where it's like now you've got everybody on set. You know, you're losing $10,000 an hour just being here, even if it's not good, right? And then if you're a group, if you're a new filmmaker or a group of filmmakers, and you do kind of fail at that attempt, it's really hard to recover from, both financially and like creatively and professionally. Whereas with these tools now, it's like you can experiment quickly and be like, does this ambitious sci-fi idea really have any legs? And can I, you know, I can produce that much more quickly without the risk to my professional reputation as a result. I just think the turnaround can be a bit faster.
All right. So one thing that really stuck out to me this week is this two projects at his company. It's a company called Deep Fusion. There's a figure in the UK called Michael Parkinson, who I think I'm reading now by most accounts is Britain's greatest talk show host, who is not alive. And so Deep Fusion, the company, and Benjamin Field, they did the ethical work, and they're really laying the groundwork for how these interesting opportunities are emerging. That they reached out to the estate and came up with an idea to bring him back from the dead. And there's a podcast in the UK now that is, you know, people are being interviewed by a not alive person, and they did the ethical work, but they also did the really interesting technology work to kind of figure out how to do this effectively and put guests on the show. I mean, I can unwrap the people they met, but it's interesting. This was right alongside another announcement, and good for his company to be making so much noise. They did then also have a film on British TV about Hammer Studios, which is like this, I guess, in the UK, an iconic horror film kind of a provider. So then the other thing that they did in the same week is they did a documentary about Hammer Studios. It's like this iconic studio that makes horror movies in the UK, featuring Peter Cushing. And you might remember him. Do you remember Rogue One, the Star Wars movie
Yeah.
that they brought back? This guy that's was not alive anymore then. So showing that we've been doing these things for a little while in Hollywood, but they brought him back because he was a big part of the Hammer Studio story. He was like played a iconic kind of horror figures, but really exciting to see. Look, this is hitting the consumer. This isn't just living in our interwebs of passionate AI creatives, but really getting into mainstream. I mean, these are kind of made for TV documentaries about kind of popular subject matter, like a horror studio or a horror film studio. And also this podcast. I'm just curious, how are you guys also reacting to this possible trend of resurrection being a new type of content?
I think it's something I think about a lot, and there's a lot of conversations because I think one of the most immediate use cases that people think of whenever they get into the world of AI filmmaking is like, oh, now you can have any actor from any point in history act in your film, and isn't that so exciting? And I do agree that from a technology perspective is really incredible. I guess what I'm more curious about is as a culture and as actual audience members who are consuming the podcast, the show, is that something that you want to interact with a lot? Or is it something that, you know, when done in moderation feels really good, but if it was the entirety of the show, do you care? Like, do you want to see Marilyn Monroe in every new rom-com ever? Or is it more interesting to have someone that's more culturally and contextually relevant to today, putting their own expressive feel into that experience? You know, I don't know if I have the answers, but I wonder if the slight gimmick nature of it is going to fade, and then we'll just get into the reality of either a literal human driving the performance of that fake actor, which I guess is kind of its own thing, or if it kind of falls into the category in the bucket that I would categorize maybe Udio and Suno in, which is super fun with your friends, very fun for like little marketing things, but not something that you turn to and want to consume again and again and again.
Yeah. I'm also torn because as a producer, I love it because I see the ease of production, by implementing something like this. But then as a young person sort of wanting to see my own career like evolve and grow over time, I'm like, well, what does this kind of replace or prevent the sort of passing of the torch that usually happens, right? Whether it's between hosts or news anchors or any public voice, like historically it's like, well, that person passes and then we kind of elect a new voice, and that keeps it flowing, and that person can bring a new generational voice to whatever was being spoken about. So I missed that a little bit in it. And it also reminds me of something my mom said years ago. She was a small town news anchor, and she said that someday we're all going to just be able to pick the voice and avatar of whoever's delivering information. So maybe less about being locked into one. Here's the guy or the person who is the voice. The user and the listener can just choose who that is themselves. So maybe this just keeps evolving and turns into that, where you can choose, this is the type of voice that I want to hear, or who I want it to be. Yeah, was it William Shatner? He's doing a lot of like AI voice scanning stuff right now, right? And maybe someday it's like, wow, I can hear William Shatner, deliver the news or be the actual voice of this interview. I don't know.
Yeah.
I think that
Well,
personalization trend is very real. And I think that that's something that I think, frankly, is already happening. And not to suddenly observe regular news, but I think people already choose where their news is coming from. And I don't think it's far removed to think what voice is saying it. But like, it's interesting. I similarly, question gimmicks. I think in the hands of somebody then looking past the gimmick and doing something interesting with it, anything is possible. But ultimately, it is like, what do the consumers do? Do they dislike it? I see a bigger trend short term that might be ideally overcome with an independent content era, that we go back to celebrating novelty and kind of what the late 90s early 2000s were for independent cinema. And I dream of it. Everything's better when we're sampling new stuff. But I do see currently where there is, call it monoculture or mainstream culture or broad culture, if anything, there's a consolidation around consistent, recognizable, familiar things. And whether that's IP, look, we just lost James Earl Jones. I'm pretty sure a lot of the VOs I heard in TV shows were often sound alikes anyway. I think his estate probably is smart enough to continue to make money off of his voice and work with AI companies. I don't know, but I'm just saying, like, I think we kind of already have these institutional sounds, voices, personalities that have become things we all come back to. You can read more deeply into that, and like, what is CBS News to people in the first place? That's like intellectually somebody's voice that makes them feel trust or something. I don't know. I'm just saying there's a bigger intellectual question of whether or not it works. And I take your point, Caleb. Like, I don't know, does the consumer care? I'd rather it get to a place that ultimately these are just among many options and new ideas flourish as well. But I think in the hands of a creative person, the gimmick will hopefully be worn off, and then it's just interesting. Like, maybe it's interesting to see Marilyn Monroe in a sci-fi movie in a way that surprises you and makes you want to watch the sequel. I don't know. I guess that's where I want to bet on creators doing something interesting besides just making gimmicks. But it's happening. It's interesting.
right. I have like kind of two different rabbit holes to go down here, because I think
Go
there's
down.
some really interesting things. It's like, in one sense, for adding in any actor you want into a scene, that you can cast whoever, and you get this like new performance or a localized performance or something like that. That's interesting from like the historical perspective, like we talked about, pulling Marilyn Monroe or James Dean or any actor throughout history, or even maybe Bruce Willis with like some of the health issues that he's going through, and bringing him into it. But where I think we're more than likely going to see even more of that technology is in stretching of voices and faces that currently have relevance in society. And so I think the best example is like The Rock. Like The Rock acts in more than what is humanly possible for The Rock to act in. And that's because there is AI technology powering The Rock's ability to be on all of these productions. And so I think that we're going to see a lot of that, whether it's with influencers, A-list actors, and they're going to be in more stuff than what they normally would be able to be in using this technology. So that might be a more immediate takeaway, and that's a larger conversation about only seeing the same faces again and again in these larger stories. But there's also the news that came out this last week about the New York Times strike. That the writers were on strike this last week, and the CEO of Perplexity reached out to them and was like, "Hey, while they're gone, we can totally pick up some of the slack and like say what you want about the way he said it." But it kind of was like sending an elbow over and being like, our tool can like replace like some of the people that are involved in the process of putting these news articles together. I know he later came out and said, no, I totally didn't mean that, but
Mhm.
in the context, it can be argued that that's what was happening. But I think that, right now with news organizations and reporters, essentially, they are taking all of the available information they can find and going out and seeking out that information. And they are serving as an algorithm that synthesizes that data together into a story that you consume that gives you perspective of the world that you're living in. And depending on the news organization, that will be a different algorithm. And, that's the end of the political conversation that I'm wanting to have about that. But I think that going forward, those algorithms and the reinforcement of the way you see the world is going to just continue to advance with AI. Like I think that people will have certain, we'll call them journalistic algorithms that will synthesize all the data. Like you can go and use ChatGPT's web search feature. It's just as updated as any Google search. And it will more than likely be skinned in with some sort of news API or whatever to where you get, Fred's news of the week. And it is very much localized for the way that you want to see the world, or the way that you don't currently see the world and that you're open to seeing it from. I think
Yeah.
it just really depends on what people are wanting to get out of it.
I'm so glad you brought up the Perplexity scabbing stuff with the New York Times, because it immediately gave me flashbacks to the writer's strike last summer, where not that, yeah, I believe in a union's, like desire to strike, fight for what they want. That's fantastic. And I'm so glad that, with the WGA, they did achieve a lot of, a lot of accomplishments. That's fantastic. But by removing your labor, right, which has historically been this really effective way of negotiating, right? You remove the labor that you offer a company, you withhold that, and then you get what you want. And now seeing that window of time, right, where no work can be completed because we're striking and we're negotiating for what we want, creates this opening for these companies to experiment with what can replace them, right? And that was my, like how I felt last summer as a writer with the strike, where it's like we're giving them, we're giving all of these companies time to do R&D to figure out how they can replace us, how they can do the thing that we're striking against. So it's like it's this contradiction. And when I saw the New York Times employees doing that, I'm like, I hope they get what they want, but they've made an opening where the New York Times can decide to fill that with something that might be more efficient for them.
I mean, I'm actually searching for it as we speak. I'm pretty sure there's someone at the New York Times whose job it is to generate AI technology
Yeah.
internally, and I don't say, and I'll confirm that before we hang up. But but I remember seeing the hire. I remember seeing a piece of news, and it wasn't like controversial, like whatever. They're a company, and everybody builds technology. To your point, whether it's wondering what people do while downtime is happening during strikes and stuff, and having curiosities about that, like yeah, like it's hard not to imagine that things aren't so black and white from a company perspective of what does it take to stay relevant in a modern, evolving technological society. How should creators, and in this case, as journalists, sort of develop a modern opinion of how they should fight for their rights and also evolve. I think this is sort of look. I feel this very personally, and why I'm here with you guys. I'm in the process of having those very real discussions with myself and my family and my professional community of like. There's a lot of things that I had projected into the next 20 years, and I think it'd be foolish for me to keep thinking about them. So it's interesting, this sort of convergence of technology, frankly, entrepreneurs, people like the Perplexity CEO, and then the people in this at the inside of these organizations that are affected by those choices.
I think yes, that is a really good point, and I think that the New York Times, it's such an institutional journalism brand, right? Like I think like a comp in the world of Hollywood might be a Disney, like a very just large historic company that does a lot of different things that a lot of people may not even realize, and they do a lot of those things very well. But I think that even those large studios like Disney, like even this last week, it was announced that they're coming out with literally an AI creative innovations department, like not just like one guy. It's like groups of people that will be leading the charge at Disney because they realize they have to move forward or they will get left behind, and the stakes are really high. And so I don't think that the people at New York Times are unaware of that. Like to your point, Fred, I'm sure there's AI researchers, and we definitely know there's AI lawyers over there because of all the takedowns and the cease and desist they've sent out over the last few months. But how they integrate it and the pressure to integrate it into journalism over the next few months and years is going to be very, very great. Because in other news organizations, being first is the most important thing. Like I look to a CNN, and being first is like kind of their whole thing. But what happens with, similar to the way the stock market is right now, when with an AI algorithm can put together a story in a second versus a human having to write it and then an editor having to take a look at it and then do whatever edits they need to do. If you're 2 hours behind, you've just missed out on 80% of the clicks you could have gotten. And like I
Yeah.
think those are the stakes for these organizations that make their money based on click-through rates, time on page, number of ads seen, all of those things.
Oh, sorry. Just the detail that stuck out to me from that Disney announcement with the AI department, which is called the Office of Technology Enablement. Um, Something that I really noticed in the story was that they really plan to integrate this and have it work with parks also. And that I thought was really interesting because they're not just thinking AI implementing AI to, film production or just for Disney Plus. Like they're thinking like, no, how can we get AI into the park experience as well? And that I found to be really interesting. I'm curious what Fred thinks.
No, I mean that's always been Disney's trump card is that they also have a theme parks business. They've been in the experience economy as long as anybody can remember since they first went. It's just I think that's been the full opportunity of them to think beyond rectangles and screens. I was just doing a quick roundup as we are saying this. Like, so we have New York Times hired Zach Stewart in December 23. He's the first editorial director of artificial intelligence initiatives. He's creating a small team to experiment with AI tools and prototype ideas. He's also looking at ethics. He's also, adapting. But that's a very forward-looking, model for a company hire. And yeah, we have Disney, we have Paramount getting bought by Skydance, and those headlines were very clear on Skydance's opinion on AI being an opportunity for a reformed studio. So I certainly don't know if these things are good or bad, but they're certainly happening. And I think it's important to sort of figure out as a creator, as an observer, as someone who's concerned, to just sort of have a healthy interest and curiosity, to keep coming back to our key adjectives here, on what is really going on here. What does that look like? What historical trends does that follow? And does it worry you? Sure, change is always worrisome because it's nice to plan things and think about the future. But I think Disney is a really good example of like it shouldn't surprise you. It's they've always had this latitude to sort of like evolve with what IP is and what storytelling is because they understand that there's other ways to interact with it as a consumer.
And that park experience is so central to, like, really Walt's original passion, right? That, like, what we're told about what his vision for Disney really was. So for them to keep investing in that experience economy, which they did first and better than anyone, and innovating that, I think would be it seems like it would be in alignment with what he would want for the company. Maybe they'll even resurrect him with and he'll he'll replace Bob Iger eventually. I don't know. Mm.
Well, they are resurrecting him. They're putting him in Disneyland. They're going to have this like new experience that's like the great moments with Mr. Lincoln, and he's going to be an animatronic. But it seems like a short little hop, skip, and jump to putting in a Walt API, and you get to ask him questions and interact, and all of those things.
Hey, Walt,
Seems
why is the food so expensive?
yeah, exactly.
Um,
Capitalism. He'd be like, "Wait, what? We have a public company now? We're on the stock market?
Yeah.
What? That should have never happened." I would love to spend some time chatting about gaming.
I mean, pretty big announcement on that front in terms of the Netflix just hired a generative AI gaming initiative uh, lead, Mike Verdu. And it's interesting because a couple weeks ago, there was another headline about how they were winding down a portion of their gaming initiative, which some people couldn't read into. Is that an admission of failure or was that an evolution? It seems to be an evolution. And from what I've read, and you guys probably are more up on it, it sounds like there's a casual gaming narrative that is different from the AAA stuff that perhaps they were winding down. And then this is this newer brainwave of bringing a Gen AI component. What did you guys take away from that announcement?
Yeah, I think that with Netflix, a lot of people don't realize that Netflix has video games. So I guess if you're listening to this, like Netflix has video games, you should go check them out, specifically on mobile. It's a lot of, you can tell, just licensed games like the balloon game and just like things that you've seen in the App Store that because you have a Netflix subscription, you can download a new application with a little Netflix logo on them and you can play them. And as long as you're subscribed to Netflix, that's completely free to you. You don't have to watch ads. It's actually pretty great. Like if you do mobile gaming, like it's kind of awesome, especially for airplanes. And it's very clear that in the Netflix TV app, like they have the trivia game currently that
Yeah.
you can play. That's like a localized experience. It's very clear that there's something there, that they are viewing engagement. Because here's the reality: if you put together like a really good tentpole film on Netflix, it's going to cost you at least $100 million, probably more, to put together something really meaningful. And that only gets 2 hours of somebody's time. But if you can put together a game that allows people to consume, let's say it's an hour a week or, a couple hours a month with, friends and family, that can have, from an engagement perspective, as much impact because some of their KPIs that they're looking at is just total time on Netflix. And it really significantly reduces the cost. And so I think it makes sense. And that's why we're seeing huge bets in gaming from both Netflix and companies like Google.
Yeah, that's what occurs to me too, is like it's just a wise way to keep people on platform because exactly what Caleb's thinking. I'm not a gamer, so I don't really have the gaming perspective here, but from the film and television perspective, I understand, someone's only going to spend 2 hours watching this movie or 8 hours watching this series, but they could spend a theoretically infinite amount of hours playing a game that never ends. So I do think it's very wise. And yeah, you mentioned Google, Caleb. That one really caught my eye, that this concept of Google working on generative infinite games.
Mhm.
That headline really and they have this little example of a game where you play like a customized wizard character, and it's generated in real time. So I think, yeah, seeing Netflix and Google both betting really big on AI for gaming, I think it's even a wiser bet than AI for filmmaking. I,
And
I do. I think
it's a
it's a
growth sector. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the investment, and if I had like VC money, I'd probably invest in AI for gaming and for like science.
Look at Jagger's moving markets today. We're doing it.
Yeah.
Keep an eye on those
And
tickers, everybody.
I totally agree with what you're saying, Jagger, and I think those two big gaming announcements from Google this last week. The first was Project Oasis, which is
Mhm.
basically kind of like a custom Minecraft game that literally is being generated in 24 frame or 20 frames per second, and all of everything is being generated as you go. So there's no core engine empowering this game. It's literally AI creating the pixels as you walk, which is mind blowing in its own way. It's of course really low res right now, but that's not going to be the case.
But the
They've already
speed, like the detail in that it's actually, and this sounds fake, but it's 100 times faster than most of these video generation models. That's that sounds like a fake statistic, but I read it and I was like, wow, that's if they've really figured that out, that's good news, I think.
right. And I think that that type of technology, just to like bring it back into filmmaking, is going to be whatever that prototype is for prompt to entertainment or some sort of live action experience where you're watching something, you have some sort of input. It's, I don't know, Black Mirror looking at your life and, talking. It's a whole story about how a naggy boss gets what they deserve at the end of the day, and it's based on the emails you sent today. Like there's so many interesting things that I think are going to be unlocked using this technology, and whether it's Project Oasis becoming a more realistic version of real time rendering, or the Project Unbound, which is what you were talking about, that you know you have a king character and like what should he do next, like he should go to the forest, and oh, it's Dungeons and Dragons, he got hurt and this his power bar went down. Like that type of thing is super fun, and Google's not the first people to take a look at that, but being able to have infinite new experiences that are not bound to engines or underlying programming is very exciting, I think.
And it relies, I think, on the creativity of the user. But that makes me think, okay, this won't be for everybody, right? Because a lot of people could be really overwhelmed or kind of draw a blank and not know really how to use this. But I think, and I'm curious what Fred thinks about this from like an observer and entertainment point of view, is like I can see the future of like, yeah, whether it's Twitch or wherever they're streaming, like us watching people playing these games and what they are doing with it. We can spectate as they kind of collaborate with this generative world in ways that not everyone's going to understand how to do right away. But I think there's just like a viewable kind of. I'd love to watch someone play this or sort of collaborate with it creatively. Yeah.
I mean, it's definitely an evolution of the Twitch stream, and if anything, it's better and more entertaining to people outside of gaming. I just can't help but think about. Have you been following this Project Sid Altera AI thing?
Mm-mm.
No.
And there was a recent update to it, but the news from like September is this project created like a Minecraft type, um,
Wow.
either it's actual Minecraft or it's a Minecraft type game, but they unleashed 1,000 bots into it, and they're just forming a civilization,
Oh, we did
and it's
Westworld. They did
happening.
Westworld.
And it's happening. And I was just at TED AI a couple weeks ago, and one of the noisier panels was led by Jeremiah Aoyang. It was all about the incoming age of agents. And
Mhm.
that seems to be somebody's idea of what we're all going to be talking about very soon, if not this time next year, will be what AI is. And to that point of like, it's fun to watch other people play. It's going to be fun to watch AI start to become its own TV show of of explore, with programmed identities that then even start to grow and evolve with some version of human DNA. I also then did you guys ever play No Man's Sky?
Mhm.
That I did you read that article too, Caleb? That they were that's suddenly become a big conversation piece about how here's this project that's been going for what 10, 15 years, has been this kind of like world creation experiment, that now suddenly there's the opportunity to drop all these AI agents into. I don't know. I just think this is where we're like, we can predict and make sense of it, but what it will probably be so much weirder than what we can imagine yet. And it'll either be scary weird or awesome weird. I don't know, but it's definitely weird. um,
Those if I can be in a world that is, like, created and inhabited by these, like, AI avatars that have made their own world that is compelling and interesting to me, if someone puts, like, point of sale elements into that experience, I think that, like, you could really corner a market of, like, immersive experience and commerce.
I mean, I think
Yeah.
that's where we start to get really creative with this. Is that like, I don't know. It's starting to become a meme of people referring to this like skeuomorphic argument around AI. Do you guys, is that old news to you guys, or is that a word?
Did you say skeuomorphic?
Okay, sorry, I
You're
can't.
you're inventing words, Fred.
Yeah. Well,
Enlighten
so,
us.
Chris Dixon from A16Z was using this word a lot around when kind of Web3 was really booming, and it was his way of trying to frame this idea that when uh, and I'll butcher some of this. I think it's mostly a design term, but I think it's been adapted into narratives of technology shifts. So call it a paradigm shift, that when like, something comes along and changes the way we look at stuff. But for example, like digital music as an easy example, like music used to be on analog things. And then at some point it started becoming digital. And the earliest iterations of digital music looked like those analog things. It was a spinning disc. But the actual digital music thing that clearly has gone on to become a big part of the way music works now is an MP3, which doesn't look like anything that it used to look like. And it's a simple way of even saying how, like, when the internet started creating websites, at first they looked like books and newspapers. They had sort of categories and chapters and all these things. And then obviously it's evolved into something a lot more different. So the point being is that there's this initial user kind of creator builder experience when something comes along and gets us to behave differently, that the initial thing kind of looks like the recent thing, but most likely the actual thing is going to be totally different. And that's kind of why I like looking at this like mental like bots experiment, is that like, I don't know what that is. I don't even know if maybe it's just some weird experiment that somebody writes a Stanford paper about, but it certainly gets me thinking like, I didn't think of that. I didn't see that one coming. Maybe somebody smarter than me did, but I guess that's to me what's so exciting about this moment and talking to you guys is we might stumble on it. That thing that well, how come we haven't done it this way yet? And I think that's what it was like when somebody made an MP3.
And I love the idea of like having these conversations, and I'm sure it's going to be something passing that we only talk about for 2 minutes, one episode that ends up being everything in 5 years, you know. And I think that there's so many ways in which this can evolve. I remember reading about that experiment that you were chatting about, Fred, and how they were talking about how it might actually be very helpful for doing societal models, you know,
Right.
and growing society, because you can test different theories of whether it's governance or transportation or whatever, and see how it would play out in these simulations rather than just kind of giving your best guess based on what you think you know about history and current, culture and society, and basically just have more data points that you can point to towards whenever you're creating new systems or processes for society. And the second thing that I wanted to chat about is just like a quote from Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari, and he said that basically, if someone tells you about the future and it is science fiction, it's probably false. But if somebody says something about the future and it's not science fiction, it's definitely false. Like the future is going to feel like it's from this like crazy place. It's going to feel like very out of left field and strange compared to what we are used to
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
And most of those predictions will not turn out the way that we are predicting them now, but it's definitely going to be very weird and very different from what we currently understand.
It's like that quote about any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic,
Mhm.
Yeah.
you
Love
know?
that. Well, I was listening to this podcast called Moonrise. That it's all about the story of how we got to the moon, and it's interesting. It covers familiar territory. It challenges your perception of JFK and things like that. But the most interesting thing to bring it back to what we're talking about is it actually starts in science fiction. And the podcaster's point of view is that the early days of science fiction writers who were kind of really inspired by what was going on with Manhattan Project, and science was very popular. It was something that really captured people's imaginations back then. They were in some ways incepting "Let's go to the moon" by writing about it. Like they were kind of just cracking the nut on it. Like, wait, so if science can do this, can it do that? And they were, and actually some of these early example of science fiction writers were actually religiously loyal to science, you know, kind of, practice, and making sure that when they would write something, it stood some filter of like, is that even, reasonably possible? But I just think that's kind of part of this, is that I think now it's not just people putting pen to paper, we're creating in all these other ways. And there's this sort of idea of like, as people, like you say, it's some idea that might have just floated by in this conversation, or some weird trailer for a movie that may or may not get made that we see show up in our AI film feeds. Like, that's kind of how this pushes forward. And it is this relationship between the creator community and, people that are paying attention and building stuff.
And it's a call to AI filmmakers to, okay, stop making movies about the robots taking over and killing us all.
Right.
Can you, let's deliberately push the creative fictional stories into, peaceful utopia, not not dystopia. We can call that in. Let's manifest that.
I like that.
Yeah, I think that's yes, a very good call to action for the community, and it's really funny to think about that, Fred. Just what ideas are being incepted into innovators and thought leaders and culture definers in the content that's going out right now. Like a lot of we talked about it on our office hours last week, but a lot of modern day horror is about machines
Yeah.
developing artificial intelligence and going wrong, and I think that's a part of the collective uh, zeitgeist today, in a similar way to like the 50s and 60s. It was all Martians landing and things from places like the moon, and that experience with the unknown. And so and there's a lot of cultural things that reasons why that was the case as well. But I think like it'll be really interesting, because I think there's these two types of stories. You have like the Black Mirror style stories, and I think some of that stuff comes true, maybe not in the way that they outline, but like, more or less like some of that stuff turns into reality. And then you have like the Star Trek technology that comes out and, increasingly is here as well. And so it's like you have these two conflicting camps with both an optimistic and pessimistic view about what can happen. And more than likely, it's going to be somewhere in the middle.
Yeah. I also remember when the James Cameron joining the Board of Stability news came out, someone like retweeted it saying, "Oh, I guess James Cameron like didn't get the warning message from his own films." And I was like, "No, that's because he he knew this would happen, and now he I don't know. It was just funny to see someone try to be him like, "You wrote the Terminator. How could you, collaborate with AI?"
Yeah, it's funny with the Terminator, because we did a news segment a long time ago, and they're like, we want to talk about AI, and it was one of those like gotcha news things where like they like interview us, and like we're us, like we want to help people find hope in all of this and like opportunity and things like that, but like they branded it as this like Terminator end of the world thing, and I wonder if like that film franchise really pushed people's perceptions of what technology could be in a hyper negative way, because I feel like everyone references the Terminator when talking about this AI stuff.
I mean, to be fair, Hal in 2001, if I'm aging myself and talking about a different era, just say so. But that was kind of the original kind of scary robot that did nasty things at the end. I don't know. I think it's easy for people to worry about things that don't feel human, and I think that's probably a good gut check, that at each of these steps, like, somebody raise their hand and say like, what happens if kids use this, or, what's the worst thing this thing could do? I think that's probably a healthy voice in all those rooms. I think the three of us were at CogX earlier this year. Did you guys go to that event?
Mhm.
Jaguar. But our friend Jeremy Boxer curated this amazing event. And one of the panels that really spoke to me was this one about AI and consciousness. And I promise not to go too deep down this rabbit hole, but it's a big one. But like, one of the comments that came up in that conversation was the way that, and this was my paraphrase, so I hope the people on that panel don't just say you got it all wrong, but I think this might be relevant to this conversation, was that like, I think when we sort of like project into AI, whether it's fears, hopes, dreams, we still do this thing where we're almost like anthropomorphizing it. We're almost saying like, what would I do if I was this super powerful thing that knew everything and had all the powers and could never sleep and whatever it is that we project upon it. but and I don't know if this makes any sense, and maybe it's just sort of like thought fodder. But somebody else said, well, if you think about consciousness, like plants have consciousness, and somebody else even said like you could even zoom out even more, like minerals and earth that have been growing over millions of years and evolving and turning into things like that's somebody's idea of consciousness. So which just gives me, it doesn't like chill me out on worrying about, but it makes me think like we might just be thinking about it one way. And it's possible that when you give technology this much range and power and difference from how we frankly behave, it might do something really different in this kind of, what does it do as this like sentient being or whatever. But I don't know if that's hopium, if we use some funny words, but it makes me just, that just makes me think differently, that I'm not sure I have it all figured out.
No, I think that perspective is sort of key. And if anybody listening does want a deeper dive on this specifically, there's a great book called Ways of Being by James Bridle. And this is what he talks about. But a comparison that he makes in that book that I've never forgotten about AI is that he compares it to our relationship with animals. And we perceive animal consciousness into these three categories: beasts, livestock, and pets. Those are these three categories, right? And if you do the same to our perception of robots, we basically see them as threats, you know, for service or for companionship. Those are these three categories. So we've projected our perception of how we perceived animal consciousness onto, we've anthropomorphized these robots. But really the point he makes in the book is what you were just saying, Fred, which is, hey, this is a different consciousness. We don't know what this does, for better or for worse. And he also goes into the consciousness of physical materials like sand and concrete, things like that. So fascinating.
I think this has become the news and rabbit holes podcast. Just saying, guys.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm here for it, guys. But you keep us on track, Caleb.
No, this is great. I guess before we kind of wrap things up, because we're hitting the hour mark here, are there any last minute stories that you think we should cover that we weren't able to chat about?
Totally, yeah. So Runway announced more advanced camera controls. Really, if you just like upload an image, you go to the left side and click on camera controls, you can toggle things more specifically, and it gives you a preview of what the tilts will look like. So it doesn't give you a full rendered preview, but it shows you, hey, if you're gonna, orbit left, here's what the frame will do, and it kind of skews. And the results were okay.
Yeah. I mean, I almost like the interface as much as the potential of it. I really like looking at it. But I mean,
The preview was big.
I mean, Caleb, you of anybody has a perspective on where these things land in not just the canon but the toolkit. What did you react to when you saw that? Does it do things that, like Jagger's almost saying, I wish, is this something you felt like you wanted? Does this feel like it's appealing to a new type of creator? How did you react to that news?
Yeah, so I think my first impression was this is interesting, but I am underwhelmed
Hmm.
at a macro level. And it's not because it's not great to have that control. Like it is great to have that control. Like any additional control we can have over our outputs helps the overall story and like where we're wanting to go. I think the disappointment comes at this point more from a lot of the other tools have more into like they're more intelligent about the physics of what is happening inside of the scene, and they're more you can direct the action a bit more than Runway, which I think is more important whenever we are getting into like some really deep, like we're wanting to tell resonant stories that are great. And so it's hard because with Runway you benefit from like an unlimited plan where you can just re-roll and re-roll and re-roll, and maybe after we'll say 50 generations you get like something really deep and dynamic that's great. But other tools that are emerging like Minimax that you hop in there, it may only take you 2 to 3 generations to get something pretty fantastic, and it tends to be closer to the prompting that you're typing in. And so it's a give and take between iteration and just overall raw quality that I think we're trying to find. But all of that being said, it is very cool that we have that inside of Runway. I think that they are, more than any company that I'm aware of in the AI video space, incredibly good at marketing and making it seem like every single new thing that comes out is the best, most important thing that's ever existed. And then when you get into it, you're like, oh, Runway Act 1, you can only use on images. So that's not very helpful. And camera control works, but it severely limits the action of the subject. Okay, well, that's not super helpful. So it's tricky. It's a give and take. Like, big fan of Runway and like everything they're doing, but as a creator, you just have to stay up to date. Like, watch the web show, listen to the things like this podcast, and really test it for yourself to make sure that it's like getting you what you are looking for, in my opinion. I think there's one more thing I'd like to chat about with you guys. So one of the big pieces of news that came out this last week was there's Flux Ultra, which is
Hmm.
a more detailed and higher resolution version of Flux, which is in terms of being able to customize, get exactly what you're looking for, integrate LoRa's control, and that's all that stuff. Flux is your best option at this point. But what I think is more interesting than just that raw announcement of Flux is the number of tools that are integrating it into user facing experiences. Because I think a lot of people, like when Flux or Stable Diffusion comes out, they think like, this is something I have to like set up a comfy UI workflow, and it's super
Hmm.
complicated and scary for the average person. But I've been really impressed by tool companies like Kriya, who basically, like, in real time, like an announcement will come out about this new model, and then like that same day, within a few hours, they're like, and we have it on our platform, and it's super easy to use. You just go into the prompt box, do this quick little thing. They're doing the same thing with training models on characters and styles and things like that. So I think I've been very impressed by companies that can be that plugin like experience that we talked about earlier with what we're hoping to get from Adobe in a single online interface. And I think like that is very appealing, to just like buy one pack of credits and be able to use like 10 different tools, as opposed to having $10 subscriptions and now you're at $100 a month. So I think that's pretty cool. I don't know if you guys have had a chance to play around with Korea.
Well, my question with it that I want to see if either of you have an answer for is like, what is the sort of like business monetary profit gain in doing this? Like, if you kind of develop a product and then you just make it a plugin for someone else's platform, how does this, how does that work?
I mean, I think I'd have to defer to my friends who know VCs and their behavior, but my gut is we're watching just another market share game. It's just
Mm.
who gets more users, because there's no way any of these places are technically P&L profitable for the foreseeable future. And if that filter goes away, then what are they up to? They're just trying to be that story, and they're just trying to be that destination. um and again, I don't claim to understand VCs, and there's smarter people that'll school me on this, but I also sometimes, as someone who tries to start businesses, wonder, how does this really work? But I think, the main, especially with open source software, by the way, like there isn't even anything to own, and so it's like it has to be a race to be easy to use. It has to be a race to be useful, because but I do wonder. I mean, I'd love to someday get a business expert on here
Well, it's like,
to predict on this stuff, because even Netflix and all the streaming companies were leveraging ownable IP along the way to being the streamer that would rule them all. I don't know what open source battles look like.
it's just
Yeah.
when I like opening Korea and being like, well, if I can use Luma, Runway, Kling, Halo, Minimax all here, then why would I pay for any of those individual subscriptions? Then I'm just giving all my money to Korea. I don't.
I could be totally wrong, but I don't think the versions you get access to through Creo there are no turbo versions in there. It felt still a lot slower than anything that would happen if I was just using Runway. Is that true?
Kling well, with Kling, the Kling one, yes, but the others were pretty fast.
Huh. Maybe they have.
Yeah. Like Luma's API is like 20 seconds. Like, it's really, really quick. There are some limitations, like to Jagger's point there. Like, Kling is a lesser version of Kling compared to what you get on their platform. And I think it'd be very wise for those companies to continue that, unless you're paying for some sort of very extreme, you know, more expensive version of the tool, because they are going to lose out to people subscribing to Korea, and Korea is going to try their best to keep everybody in their ecosystem and convince them that they will be the most up-to-date tool, and they're going to just bring in whatever tool is most relevant. Like, I think that brands in the AI space that position themselves like that are at an advantage. And to be fully honest, Curious Refuge is in that place. Like, we intentionally don't take on paid sponsorships for our training, or like our tutorials or anything like that, because we want to be as objective as possible and not beholden to any one specific workflow or tool.
Yeah, but that as an average user or like a person who doesn't know a lot about AI, I don't know that Kriya's version of Kling is the slow version, and that if I subscribe to Kling, I'll get like a better, faster version. Like I don't know. There's nowhere to see that. So you're just going to assume as an average user, oh, Kling's really slow. That's all my takeaway.
So I'm on it right now, and it does seem to some things have changed since I first used it. But it'll tell you when you pick the model. You can do the 1 minute generation on Luma, 1 minute generation on Runway, but it's a 10-minute on Kling Standard or Pro, as well as Hailuo.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah,
but that just makes me think. I just think, oh, that one's slow, so I don't want to use it. That's all. Like as if I just became ignorant about AI tools, I would just be like, oh, that one's not as good.
I do wonder I would have to test out Kriya for myself. I've done some generations, but I'd be really curious about batch creation, because I know with, like, for example, Minimax, one of the limitations if you're using their platform is they're like, per person, you can only queue up, I think it's like 3 at a time.
Yeah.
Which is not ideal. But if you in Kriya, if you can just hit that button 10 times if you need to, and all you're doing is paying credits. I know the CEO of Kriya said that they are going to be as like close to the price as possible as like what it would be if you're just raw purchasing the API credits directly from them. So, I mean, if that's true, I think from a user experience, that'd be amazing. Like you can generate as much as you need. You can, you know, if you have 10 different shots, you can generate 10 each. You can go like make a sandwich, come back in 10 minutes and like do a rough version of dailies with your quick little, or I guess we can call them like hourlies with your editing experience. So it seems pretty powerful, but yeah, the price is going to be very expensive and is quite expensive.
I mean, I know some of us know people close to the projects. I don't claim to ask anybody for things that aren't able to be spoken about. But as far as Sora coming soon, I can't help but wonder, the same way that Search GPT or whatever the tool, I mean, how quickly that became a quick search wars thing in terms of what happened when this inevitable tool emerged. I can't wait to find out, how does this sort of the thing that kind of kicked off the initial Hollywood sort of reaction to generative AI. It's going to be very interesting when that tool lands for consumers in the context of this, because these are not Microsoft-backed companies we're talking about, so it's going to be really interesting.
Well, this was really fascinating. Thank you both for being here. I love debriefing all the AI news of the week and breaking this down. And for anybody listening, feel free to subscribe to Curious Refuge's channels. You can sign up for our newsletter on curiousrefuge.com. And that's where you can check out all of the AI courses that we have to offer. So yeah, excited to chat more in the coming weeks.